Hi, I'm Oliver Nowak, and I present the work Shaping Textile Sliders, an evaluation of form factors and tick marks for textile sliders. For this, I work together with René Schäfer, Anke, Philipp Wacker, and Jan Borchers from RWTH Aachen University. The most common way to control smart home devices like lights, fans, and media devices are movable remote controls and speech. While remotes are not necessarily always there when they are needed, speech might be inappropriate in certain scenarios, for example when watching a movie. With textile interfaces, we can integrate unobtrusive controls for smart home devices where they are needed. For example, into furniture like sofas and beds, but also into decoration like table runners and pillows. While we found many technical contributions in the field of textile interfaces, we found only a few recommendations for form factors of textile controls. Since sliders can be used in many scenarios in the home, for example when setting the brightness of the lights, we wanted to start with those and investigate how those should be designed. Especially how different form factors of sliders can help users orientating when using the sliders eyes-free. For this, we created a set of different sliders. The simplest element you can find on Textiles are single seams, so we decided to use those as the probably most unobtrusive slider element. In the following, we call those sliders path sliders. Furthermore, we created closed-shaped sliders that have a two-dimensional body like a rectangle. Since textiles do not have to be simply flat, we created sliders with different profiles. We differentiate between sliders that are raised from the surface, in this case simply embroidered onto the fabric, and sliders that are recessed. Recessed sliders were fabricated by adding a 3 mm thick padding under the fabric and embroider the slider on the fabric together with the padding. Similarly, we created profiles for closed-shaped sliders. We differentiated between sliders those outlines were embroidered into the fabric without the addition of padding, so the inner parts are flat, and sliders that have a raised or recessed inner area. As already mentioned, we were interested in slider designs that help the users estimating their position on the slider. Therefore, we changed the shapes to offer different features that help orientating. The rectangle slider served as baseline. Here, the participants could only use the start and the end of the slider as orientation help. The tick mark slider is a rectangle slider that uses the well-known concept of tick marks to offer help at discrete 10% steps. With the W slider, we used another way to communicate the discrete steps within the slider. There, the direction change should indicate that the next 25% step of the slider is reached. The triangle should continuously help the users by increasing the distance of the upper and lower seam when moving from left to right. With rainbow, the slope of the slider should help estimating the current position. And for practical reasons, we added horseshoe as a variant of rainbow that is bent more to save some space. To investigate what of those form factors is preferable, we conducted a user study with 20 people in the age of 22 to 28 years. The study was divided into 4 parts: path versus closed-shaped sliders, the comparison of the profiles for path sliders and for closed-shaped sliders, and the comparison of the different shapes. For each phase, the sliders were placed on a padding behind a side protection wall. Behind this wall, the participants could explore all slider variants. For all phases except the ones for the shapes, we provided a rectangle, a W, and a horseshoe slider for each form factor to enable the participants to test several movement patterns. In the shape phase, each shape was tested separately. There, we asked participants to find some locations on the slider to get a first impression on the real usage scenario. We found that raised path sliders and flat closed-shaped sliders performed significantly worse in all comparisons. Participants' comments made clear that those were much harder to recognize. However, if you have to use such sliders, the rankings and comments suggest to use path sliders, since they were easier to follow. Recessed and raised closed-shaped sliders were rated similarly. However, we found that recessed sliders are significantly more comfortable to use and are more suited for sliding gestures. The W slider was most disliked by our participants. They criticized that it was too complex to recognize eyes-free. Furthermore, our observations and the participants' comments showed that the idea of the triangle slider did not work well, and that the participants rather used the start and the end points for the orientation. Rainbow, tick mark, and horseshoe were ranked best by the participants. After we knew from our first user study that we should use recessed sliders and that tick marks and curved sliders work well, we measured users' performance in a second user study with 20 participants. The goal was to investigate how well the slider designs can help the users orientating and thus selecting a value more confidently. For this, we split the study into 2 parts, a selection task and an estimation task. For both, the setup was similar to the first user study. For the selection task, the participants were asked to set a certain percentage value on the slider. They moved from a homing position underneath the slider to the slider and did the selection. Next to the two curved sliders, we used rectangle sliders with a varying amount of tick marks. We used a blank slider as baseline and sliders with tick marks that represent 50, 33, 25, 20 and 10% steps. We found that 20 and 25% steps improve the selection accuracy significantly in comparison to the horseshoe, blank and rainbow slider. Surprisingly, the participants were significantly faster with 25% steps than with 20% steps. However, the participants were also fastest with 25% steps. Looking at the participants' rankings, we found that any additional help was appreciated. 20 and 25% steps got the highest ranks, while 33% steps made the estimation harder. So far, we determined what people can do to find a position on a slider. But to do this, they had to explore the most of the slider before doing the selection, since all tick marks felt the same. Our next question was whether varying the tick mark design can help the user to get a good estimation of their position when starting the selection. For this, we again tested curved sliders and used the regular tick mark design as baseline. Additionally, we varied the tick marks by rotating them, changing their size and position, and changing the number of dots per ticks to create a different tactile sensation. While all of those are based on 3 equally distributed tick marks, we additionally tested a design where the density of tick marks should help the users orientate. For the estimation task, we guided the users to a certain location using a plastic slide, such that they could not get any hints of their position while approaching the slider. From that position, we asked the participants to move as little as possible, but as much as necessary to estimate the initial position. In the estimation task, all estimations on sliders with equidistant tick marks were significantly better than on curved sliders. Leaving the rotating tick marks out, equidistant tick marks improved the estimation significantly in comparison to the curved sliders and when the tick marks get denser. The gesture footprint was significantly reduced when using equidistant varying tick marks. The participants' rankings and their ratings for the distinguishability are in favor for dotted, elevating and rotating tick marks, with dotted performing slightly worse. Based on the results for both studies, we present a first set of design recommendations for textile sliders and their tick marks. If you cannot use any padding for the slider, prefer path shapes. Otherwise, use raised or recessed sliders. Especially recessed sliders support sliding gestures well. For typical use cases, use 3 to 4 tick marks. And if a slider should enable fast and confident value estimation, our tick mark designs with rotating and moving tick marks were preferred by our participants. Thank you very much for your attention.